We are so glad that you guys are here to join us, and we recognize that several hundred people signed up for this webinar, signifying to us that this is one of the major challenges of our time in our homeless and government systems. My name is Deme Hill. I'm the Principal Consultant of Housing and Homelessness for Advocates for Human Potential, otherwise known as AHP. I've been working in this field since 1994, basically since I was 2. And I joined AHP as a national technical assistance and training provider after leaving public service for local governments and as a former continuum of care lead. Early in my career, I worked in criminal justice, which ties into some of the things we're going to talk about today. And we as a team have really been analyzing homelessness across our country and the impact on encampment sweeps in our nation. And so we understand that there's a lot of work that we need to do in this area. And at Advocates for Human Potential, we believe that everyone deserves a home. Homelessness is truly solvable, and it is the fabric and core of who we are as an organization. And if you don't believe that, you are still welcome to join us today. And we understand that this is not just a battle, but an all-out war for humanity. Homelessness is one of the top 5 humanitarian crises in our country, if not the world. And if you particularly add in natural disaster displacement, we know that this is a huge issue. And make no mistake, housing solves homelessness. And we firmly believe that innovation is needed to curtail homelessness and that we cannot keep doing the same thing. And lastly, we need to have deep community discussions within our own communities about how we will collectively deal with encampments in the most humane, compassionate, and responsible manner. And now I will pass it on to Nicky to introduce herself, my wonderful coworker and contemporary.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nicky Stevens. I'm a senior program manager and trainer here at Advocates for Human Potential. And just to give you a little bit about my background, I've been working to end homelessness and provide people with housing for now almost over 20 years now. And I'm from the beautiful state of Arizona. And here in Arizona, I've worked in various arenas. And I probably have done every single intervention you can think of to assist people in ending their homelessness, from providing housing through permanent supportive housing, by doing transitional housing, housing for families, veterans, and also some of my most important work, I feel like, was doing direct services for unsheltered people. So one of those things was in the beautiful city of Tempe, Arizona, where I was in charge of the homeless solutions department there, where we worked with a lot of encampments. And we worked with a lot of people who are unsheltered and who are vulnerable. This is something that's important to me. It's close to my heart, and I'm hoping that we can have some recommendations that'll be helpful to you and your communities, whether you're coming from a nonprofit sector to the government sector. I think we have some recommendations that will be helpful to you, and hopefully you will leave this presentation with a more optimistic opportunity to support the unsheltered folks in your community. And is it still my jam to keep going? Okay, yes. So one of the things we'd like to know is who is on the webinar. So if you want to tell us your name, the agency you're from, and the city and state, that would be great. And also, what do you think is the most pressing issue due to the grants pass decision? If you don't know, you're on this call, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about what the Supreme Court deemed for the grants pass versus Johnson decision, and what do you think that most pressing issue is in regards to that decision that was made by the Supreme Court? We'll give everyone a minute probably to do that, and we can kind of keep going as as people drop that in the chat. So the overview today is that we will be going through defining the populations that are experiencing homelessness, the impacts to our most vulnerable populations, the criminalization of homelessness, and some recommendations, specifically some examples that I've used when I worked with unsheltered folks that were living in encampments. And slide. Okay, and just kind of give you a little bit of background. Like I said, I've worked in the state of Arizona for over 20 years now, but now I'm at Advocates for Human Potential, which is a wonderful organization. And we strive to influence change in health and other systems to support vulnerable populations. Our areas of expertise include housing, homelessness, addiction, substance use, behavioral health, policy reform, and systems integration, and much, much more. At the end, you'll be given a link that you can QR code to our website that'll hopefully give you a lot more information about the amazing work that we do across the country. So we'd love to invite you to allow us to help you reach your full potential.
Just a little bit more about our background. So we help federal agencies. We also help state agencies and providers of healthcare, behavioral health, and housing systems and supportive services. We deploy these capacities at every level because we know that change does not flow in one direction. And really, comprehensive health and change management is what we do. At the end of the day, our goal is to help communities make change through a compendium of modalities, including workforce development, technical assistance, training, research and development, and administering large amounts of government funding throughout the country. At this point, we are administering about $9.5 billion. And we will jump right into the presentation. Nikki?
Okay, so let's talk about defining the populations. So we're going to go over some of the populations that experience homelessness and just kind of give you a background. So currently, there's an estimated over 653,000 people throughout the country, according to the annual homelessness assessment report, that have experienced homelessness in one night. And the AHAR report is used in conjunction, it's reported to Congress and used in conjunction with the annual point in time count. And the annual point in time count is 1 week, usually at the end of January, where communities across the country go out and actually interview people who are living unsheltered, and they get that information and feed it back up to Congress. So according to 2023, since 2023, we've had since 2016, we've seen a continuous rise of people experiencing homelessness throughout the country. And it's affecting every state, every community across the country, and including all ages, sexual orientation, races, but one thing we're going to talk about a little bit through this presentation is the disparate impact of people of color who experience homelessness throughout our communities. And so to give you a little bit of background about unsheltered homelessness, unsheltered homelessness is obviously people living in places that are not meant for human habitation, such as cars, parks, sidewalks, abandoned buildings, literally on our streets. And, we know unsheltered people reside, sheltered people reside in shelters. And in 2023, we saw a record high of over 256,000 people. That's almost 40% of the people who experience homelessness that are unsheltered. And we know that being unsheltered, it continues to be at a risk for those folks because of, not having access to clean water, healthy food, or, being able to dispose of their waste in a humane way, as well as the risk to others. A lot of times, the risk to themselves, because a lot of times people live in encampments because of the safety in numbers. So let's talk about what an encampment is. So these are just like some pictures from Los Angeles that kind of demonstrate what some of the encampments you've seen probably across the country look like. But it is defined around a camp located along a sidewalk or other right-of-ways, by creeks, riverbeds, or other waterways, tents, lean-to structures. And it's any outdoor location on public or private property where one or more individuals has established temporary living accommodation, typical structures like tents. And, a lot of times people may choose to live in encampments for that sense of safety in numbers and protection from police harassment or sighting, or to avoid the threats of, even if they've been evicted, someplace where they can feel like a safe community. And, in our rural homelessness, encampments may look different as well. So these may be folks that are living in your woods. They may be living in, in other structures, abandoned buildings, and other places that you may not see them in the urban areas as much. But nonetheless, they are still living in substandard housing.
And so these are the key drivers of homelessness. Number one is the lack of affordable housing across the country. And I say affordable housing, poverty, racial discrimination, violence, psychiatric and substance use disorders, inequitable access to healthcare, education, and trauma. As a matter of fact, in the 80s, trauma was the number one reason why people experienced homelessness. But now, today, researchers argue that it is 100% housing unaffordability. So we're going to jump into talking about our vulnerable populations.
Okay, so I'm going to take it over here. So some of the vulnerable populations that we know just based on data is our BIPOC populations that's our Black, Indigenous, and people of color in our LGBTQ plus community. So like poverty, homelessness in the US is not race neutral. BIPOC populations experience homelessness at disproportionately higher rates. And it's important to note that BIPOC communities experience criminalization in disparate and discriminatory ways as well. This is not only Black and Indigenous people of color, but they also have higher rates of, they're more likely to be cited or be involved in the criminal, be associated with criminal activity just because they're people of color. And we know that they're less likely to also seek treatment because of the stigma attached to mental health or with substance use. So we know Black Americans represent 13% of the population, but they're almost 40% of the people experiencing homelessness throughout our country. And Indigenous people account for only 1.5% of the North American population, yet they make up over 10% of the homeless population in the United States. And the largest increase we've seen in homelessness in 2023 was 40%, and that was among Asian and Asian Americans. And the largest numerical increase we saw was among Latino and Latina population, with nearly 40,000 more experiencing homelessness since 2022. That's such a significant increase. And also, let's not forget the racial justice impacts on BIPOC populations, lack of access to those social economic opportunities that a lot of that white people experience versus people of color. And those income inequality, as well as poverty, systemic racism, housing discrimination, and higher incarceration rates for the same crimes as other folks, and the lack of access to quality health care. And let's not forget the most important why we're here, the inequities within the homeless response system that dramatically affect people of color. So those racial justice gaps impact BIPOC populations more than other populations because of multitude of factors, including, we can't forget that these are linked, and we do not have enough affordable housing, decent, safe places to live, jobs that pay a living wage, and access to quality healthcare, transportation, education. And we will continue to see people of color disproportionately impacted because of these systemic issues. And I like this quote: of all the factors contribute to the systems where racism, homelessness, and the criminal legal system are intertwined, and they are inseparable. Because we're seeing a lot of business districts and a lot of other resources being used against unsheltered populations, and we're seeing those disparate impacts among people of color. Little curtain. Understanding the impacts, the more impacts is there, We know that BIPOC populations are more likely to experience police harassment, get more complaints from the communities, and the police called more times. They're more likely to be arrested for those same crimes. They're more likely to receive harsher sentences, and they're more likely to be turned down for housing units if they are looking. And they're less likely to treat, like we spoke about, less likely to seek treatment due to the stigma attached to that. And the risks of homelessness and housing instability are not equally shared among, just people of color, but our youth, people of color, are more likely to have these challenges. And we'll talk about that a little later. And we know that people of color also spend longer periods of time experiencing homelessness in comparison to their white counterparts. And they're also increasing their risk of re-entering homelessness as well. And the challenges for the BIPOC age of youth between 13 and 25 is that they're more likely to experience, sexual trauma, more likely to be sex trafficked, and there's a lot of other disparities that we'll talk about a little later. And I also just want to speak a little bit on our LGBTQ plus community and the impacts that has when we are talking about trying to house them as well. So the members of the LGBTQ community face discrimination in many areas of their lives, especially regarding housing status. And we think about people who are in transition and they're being turned away from shelters, and they're trying to get a new ID or anything like that. So we know there's not enough shelter beds for LGBTQ plus. Jails often do not honor their sexual identity or how they identify as male versus female. And we also know that there's impacts on the mental and physical health. And the intersection of different marginalized identities compound these inequities, especially when you start talking about people of color and LGBTQ plus. And we know that from interviews that have been conducted, there's a greater risk to youth LGBTQ plus as well. And there's greater risk of adversity before and during homelessness. And one of the important things I want to note here is that we should be looking for shelters and services that honor LGBTQ plus community and making sure that those resources are available when and if they're asked for. Okay.
We also want to note here that we understand that there is a lot more vulnerable populations, but we just don't have the time today to go through every single one of them. But I did want to mention that because we have not forgotten about the other vulnerable populations as well, such as our veterans and our domestic violence and our human trafficking survivors, and the list goes on. Today we're going to talk about the criminalization of homelessness and really kind of dig in here around the history a little bit. So homelessness has really been tracked since 1640. When the federal government first started documenting homelessness and the first cases of homelessness of what's called poorhouses. And we haven't solved it yet, but I do believe that we can. And I believe that whether it's this generation or the next generation to come, we definitely can solve it. But in the 1880s, they began really criminalizing life-sustaining acts, such as what they called self-sheltering. And today we call that camping. Sleeping, resting, or eating, and asking for donations. So we have started criminalizing homelessness within the last, 50 years and really tracking it. And to be honest with you, the way that we track it is very convoluted, because you can be arrested or cited for something, but yet that doesn't tie into homelessness. So we don't know the far-reaching effects of the criminalization of homelessness. But we do know that the relationship between criminal justice involvement and homelessness is bidirectional, meaning if you are involved in one system, you have likely been involved in the other or have a greater likelihood of being involved in the other system. So housing segregation is really one of the key things that spurred the Fair Housing Act in 1968 as a direct result of what was happening to people experiencing homelessness and the disparities that exist in the criminal legal system, as well as the overall housing systems, including renting, lending, and buying, etc. So according to the National Homeless Law Center, since 2006, there are state statutes that are criminalizing homelessness all across the country. There's a record of 187 cities, although we know this count is not up to date. And we do know that within the last year or two, there have been a lot more cities that are banning homelessness, as well as, I don't want to say banning homelessness, but ordinances for camping, self-sheltering, etc. But the Law Center found that there was citywide bans on camping that it was increased by 92%, sitting, lying, or sleeping laws by 78%. In other words, that it's growing exponentially, that enforcement actions are happening. Nikki, did you want to jump in here?
No, I think you have went through a lot of what we've seen through the criminalization of homelessness, and this continues to be an issue after the Supreme Court decision. A lot of more communities are looking at ways that they can criminalize homelessness. So I think this is a good way that you have allowed us to look at the numbers, the percentages too, and saw how there's been an increase across the board.
And there has. So there's been a significant increase in bans and ordinances, but the true count to date is not easy to grasp. We do know that it's increasing, and what it looks like in practice is homeless people being cited for jaywalking, littering, panhandling, loitering, vagrancy, trespassing, disturbing the peace, and other types of citations and or arrests. We also know that what it looks like in practice, and what you're seeing happening across the country, is ordinances removing, citing, or arresting persons experiencing homelessness for camping bans, sit, lie, sleep laws, encampment sweeps, confiscation of personal property, no parking or sleeping in vehicles. That's a huge one, including our RVs. Now you're seeing ideas coming out with no blankets, no pillows, no sleeping bags, things of that nature, as well as hostile architecture, which we will talk about on the next slide. So hostile architecture, I think we went too far. Come back, little birdie. Birdie's coming backwards. Hold on. That was so cute. Hostile architecture. Here's some visual examples where communities are putting up different types of architectural sculptures, rocks, etc., to keep people from lying, and sleeping in those areas. So these are ways that you're finding, the homeless being further and further pushed out of communities by creating unwelcoming spaces.
And can I just add to that? And then we also, you see the tax dollars being used to create some, you didn't have to bring the birdie back, but our tax dollars are being used to create, these unwelcoming environments, but we could be using those tax dollars towards actually providing housing and services. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Nikki. Okay, Birdie's out of here for good this time. So according to the National Law Project, again, we want to talk about our young people, because we feel that, young people often are a missing population in our country. And we know that there is a lot of initiatives to solve youth homelessness across the country. And so we're talking about young people up to age 24. In some communities, they go up to 25 and even older. But they can be arrested for status offenses, for running away from home, skipping school, staying out past curfews. So we see, consumption of alcohol, tobacco. We see, the criminalization of youth homelessness as well. The second a youth walks out the door, they could potentially be committing an offense. Even our youth that are suffering some sort of abuse, whether it's physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. As well as it is, in 20 states, harboring a runaway or a youth is considered a crime. And so, or concealing a minor, or making it difficult for shelters or friends to even take in an unaccompanied youth, and particularly minors. So there's other barriers around curfew laws, truancy laws, and child welfare. And we wanted to make sure that we did not forget our young people, because we know that youth homelessness is solvable, and no young people should be left outdoors. So findings suggest that anti-homeless laws enforcement really fail to reduce homelessness, and that people just circulate between neighborhoods and police jurisdictions and get shuffled along, moving space to space. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's happening in homeless systems across the country as we've been going to conferences and doing trainings and listening to our local communities talk about what's happening now that these bans are in effect. So the process, again, does not only reduce homelessness, but it reproduces homelessness. And it does more harm than good in the long run. It's very cyclic in nature. So somebody gets a ticket, a fine, a warrant, they get incarcerated or often institutionalized in a mental health type of facility because, you know, you're taking their stuff, they've had a mental health breakdown, and now you're getting arrested and you're either getting, you know, going to jail or you're going getting 5150 and put in a mental institution. And then you get out and now you're homeless again. And then, you know, you get cited again, they see you again. And so it's basically, they feed into each other and they prolong and expand the issue, and it creates barriers to getting housing in the long run. Because if somebody has, you know, active tickets, warrants, fines, criminal history, it makes it very difficult for them to be housed until those issues are dealt with. So now we're moving on to the meat and potatoes of why you guys are here and really the impact of the Grants Pass versus Johnson decision. And in the United States, we have a little bit of history to talk about before we get to Grants Pass. And so in 2019, Martin v. Boise was passed, which made it illegal for the criminalization of homelessness or people to be arrested for sleeping outdoors or on public property when there was no other shelter in that community. And so the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals found that it was cruel and unusual punishment, and that case settled in 2021 for $1.7 million. And many people in the homeless systems across the nation found that as a win in a sense, that we could no longer just arrest people for being homeless, particularly if they had nowhere for folks to go. Grants Pass, the most recent decision, really turned that over. And this is a 2024 decision that just passed a couple of months ago, about 3-4 months back. And the Supreme Court ruled that people experiencing homelessness can be arrested, ticketed, and fined for sleeping in public places, and also prohibiting overnight camping. And so there's several implications of, you know, what that means for communities now that the Supreme Court has passed that decision. And this is what we're grappling with today. And so, Nikki, did you want to jump in here on this next slide and talk a little bit about, actually, you're the following slide. Let me finish this point here. So there were several thousand people who got together and put together what's called amicus briefs. And these briefs were submitted to the Supreme Court to argue in favor or for this decision. An amicus brief is really a friend of the court. And it's somebody who has a strong interest in the subject matter of a lawsuit, but who's not a direct party to the litigation. So amicus briefs can serve multiple purposes, including addressing a policy issue, providing a more sympathetic advocate, to supplement or bolster a party's brief, or provide some sort of historical context or a technical issue. It could be to endorse a party or to seek or mitigate the effects of a potentially important court opinion, whether the opinion is damaging or helpful. So there were 140 that were actually submitted, but they were filed by organizations and groups of people and groups of organizations, some for and some against the Supreme Court decision. There were coalitions, service providers, disability rights groups, law firms, municipalities, governments, and national organizations that filed these briefs. Nikki, this is where I need you to jump in.
So to bring it back to the Grants Pass versus Johnson decision, and Johnson is the lawyer, a part of the law firm that supported this unsheltered person. And it was brought by the plaintiff, Deborah Blake, in 2018. And so the ordinances in Grants Pass, some of the stuff that Deme was speaking about, is sleeping in the streets, alleys, or doorways, camping on sidewalks and all public property and city parks. Camping meaning having bedding, sleeping bags, or any materials used for bedding purposes for the purpose of maintaining a temporary place to live, whether or not such places incorporates the use of a tent, lean-to, shack, or any other structure or any vehicle part thereof. And so what they were doing is fines were $25 for sleeping, $295 for camping. Unpaid fines could lead to order to stay out of city parks, and violating these exclusion orders could lead to up to 30 days in jail and or fines. So let's kind of rewind a little bit. So think about the fines that are occurred when somebody's just sleeping. As we know, when people are experiencing homelessness, they're tired. They don't have they're usually up late at night because they're afraid for their safety. So they're not sleeping well. So they're sleeping wherever they can. So they were being fined $25 each time they were found sleeping. And if they were found with camping materials, they were fined $295. And I don't want us to forget that there was no public shelters in grants passed. There was only one faith-based shelter, and they required religious-led services each day, along with a lot of other rules. And if you've worked in ending homelessness as long as I have, we know that that's always sometimes a block for people to be able to even want to go in to ask for assistance. They're trying to have a safe place to be, but this was the only thing that was available. So this is where that lawsuit was brought on behalf of Deborah Blake, which I think unfortunately she has passed away. But her legacy lives on as we continue to ensure that people have a safe place to live and sleep.
So within this U.S. Supreme Court decision, it has sparked significant debate across the homeless service systems and governments, which that's probably who's here today, right? Our homeless systems providers, as well as local governments across the country. So supporters really are arguing that it's a necessary step to address the growing homeless crisis to ensure public safety. However, critics contend that a policy mandate that criminalizes homelessness without offering adequate solutions and long-term housing is just another challenge. So we are really at one of the most difficult decisions of our time in our homeless systems. We're on this pendulum, right? And sometimes it swings far right and sometimes it swings far left. And we are struggling as a nation to find balance. But we do recommend that balance is needed really to discuss how we dismantle encampments, because enforcing criminalization has a huge ripple effect that we may not understand the magnitude of these decisions to arrest people for years to come. So a couple of weeks ago, I was in Illinois meeting with a team of lawyers, really discussing how the implications of the criminalization is impacting communities there, as well as marginalized groups. And at the same time, a faith-based provider stepped up to talk about what they were doing to solve the issue. And one of the things that really stuck out to me at that conference was that there was a chief of police, one chief of police that said, we're not going to create an ordinance and we're not going to do anything differently because we have an amazing relationship with our homeless service providers. So to enforce a camping ban was not needed. So through all the drama that was happening in the community with the city council and everybody trying to decide what do we do next and how do we enforce this, it took one police chief to step up and say, I'm putting the brakes on it. And he did, and it was kind of just dead in the water after that. And that community moved on and continued to work together to solve homelessness in their community in the best way that they knew how without criminalizing folks. So due to that one leader stepping up. So communities really have to work together to make a decision on what is best for their community. And our goal today is really to talk about the implications and ensure that we do what is best and possible to solve the problem. Make no mistake, again, housing solves homelessness, and we must align our thoughts with our national leadership.
And I would just like to add to that, as communities, you can make your own decisions. Like I said, I've worked for the city of Tempe, Arizona. We had some amazing people that got together and said, we don't want to follow this way. We want to create our own ordinances. We want to support ending homelessness. So it is up to communities to make that shift and make that decision for what's best for their community. Just like we talk about people who experience homelessness and what's best for them, it's your community. You know what's best for the people that you're serving. And your outreach teams are are speaking to people every day. They know those things as well. So making sure that we're getting those voices at the table when decisions are being made. So according to the National Alliance to End Homelessness, the decision, this is their quote, this decision sets a dangerous precedent that will cause undue harm to people experiencing homelessness and give free rein to local officials who prefer pointless and expensive arrests as imprisonment rather than real solutions. And again, housing ends homelessness. So instead of putting your resources in arresting and jailing someone, let's talk about resources around supporting folks and getting them into a safe space. And as we said, the Alliance has expressed extreme disappointment with the ruling, noting that it will do nothing to address the primary cause of homelessness in the United States, a severe, prolonged nationwide shortage of affordable housing. Oops.
Somebody.
Are you still there, Deme? You're cutting in and out. I can go ahead and talk about this until Deme comes back on. We're taking a closer look at policy implications since the passing of Grants Pass, and specifically in California, where the rate of homelessness is the highest in the country. After Grants Pass, Governor Newsom of the California ordered state agencies to address encampments in the communities with urgency and dignity. Do you want to go ahead and take this over, Deme? Are you back?
Sure, I'm here. I don't know what happened. It cut me out and let me come back in. And we use California as an example because right after the Grants Pass decision, Governor Newsom in California made some specific directives to state agencies that have authority over, that he has authority over, advising to respond. But there was also recommendations for local governments to respond. But I think there was some confusion among what local governments are supposed to do, really based on the media coverage. So there's one major clarification to this executive order. This was not a directive to counties and cities and continuum of cares, et cetera. This was a directive to state agencies. It was a recommendation to cities, counties, and continuum of cares entities, because the state of California has spent billions of dollars on attempting to solve homelessness, and he really wanted communities to take action. Moving on. Can you advance the slide for me, Katie, please? Looks like I lost slide control when I dropped. Thank you. So now we're going to talk about dismantling encampments. And Nikki, I think this is your slide here.
Yes, it is. So we also don't want to forget the impacts on folks' mental health when you're dismantling encampments. So, these sweeps can impact, especially those with serious mental illness. And it destabilizes people with no solution to homelessness. I saw some people in the chat referring to this as well. And I'm so happy that you all understand that. And those negative experiences with law enforcement could just exacerbate mental health conditions and preventing future access to services, or people don't want to engage, and can lead to mental health breakdowns, and without appropriate resources or places, and can result in reinstitutionalization, whether that be through hospitalization or jails. We also don't want to forget the negative impacts on the people, or for people's mental health when they're experiencing trauma. It's very dehumanizing, and it traumatizes people when these sweeps are happening without some tips that we'll share later on, because you need to prep the places. It's not just coming in and taking everybody's personal belongings and telling them to move along. There's a lot of anxiety and fear after being displaced, and the unpredictability of sweeps. When are they going to come? Who's going to come? Are they going to throw away all my stuff? Are they going to arrest me? Are they going to cite me? And it also there's a feeling of loss. Even thinking about moving, when we all have to move or we change a job or whatever, there's a sense of loss that we all have. And that's the same with people who are experiencing homelessness and after they're losing their belongings. And maybe it's not a place that you would call a home, but that's where they feel safe at. And it's disruption. Sweeps can disrupt the daily routines and cut people off from those social connections and their familiar surroundings. And it also exasperates existing mental health problems. Could you imagine if somebody came in your home and just said, hey, threw out all your stuff and said, hey, you got to move along? And it's kind of just like playing whack-a-mole. And also the motivation, after you're displaced, people are less motivated to pursue health-related goals, such as taking their medication or seeking treatment. And, their and the fear that they have associated with this. And also the access to care, because the displacement can create barriers to accessing medical care and other outreach services. And there's material loss and belongings and medical items, the geographic displacement, community fragmentation, loss to follow up from outreach teams, and that's huge. So just because I did oversee outreach teams when I did direct service work, and the amount of anxiety it caused my outreach teams when they couldn't locate someone, when their encampment was dismantled and they were unable to find the people that they were trying to serve. They kind of came up to the top of a waiting list for housing. They're like, oh no, where do I find them now? Or their ID was lost, or whatever that case is. So just keeping that in mind when you're when you're thinking about how encampments impact people's mental health. And the impacts of long-term solutions for ending homelessness, again, I know that a lot of you already know this: loss of identification when all of their items are thrown away, social security cards, birth certificates, other important documents about their immigration status or legal history, medical history, housing history, proof of veteran status, your DD 214s. That's how we get a lot of our unsheltered veterans housed, medical equipment, medicine that they may need. And it undermines the path to housing, because these sweeps are a temporary fix that don't effectively connect people to housing or services. They don't end someone's homelessness. So they can harm their health by stripping people of necessities like their personal belongings and their social support. And they could also drive people into isolated spaces where their health could be more at risk than normal. And it strips people of their dignity as well and increase those health risks. It also damages trust, which is huge. When you're doing outreach work, which if there's outreach teams on here, you understand this. Trust is the number one thing that you need to build before someone will even accept services. And that's when you damage that trust, it's going to be hard for folks to want to engage in services with you at a later date. They may think, oh, you're responsible for this happening to me. And there's also, we talked about the cost-effective solutions and the cost effectiveness of doing sweeps versus providing someone with housing. So you think about $1,600 for $1,600 to $6,000 per unsheltered person a year to do these sweeps of encampments. We can provide somebody with a great amount of services and housing with that money. It also disrupts the routines, of people's survival. It increases substance use, which people may not think about that, but it does. It also increases feelings of hopelessness and loss, and it can further marginalize unhoused people and decrease their agency and autonomy. So when we're talking about dismantling encampments, we don't want to, we want to talk about those impacts on the community. So people becoming disconnected to outreach services, as we just spoke about. So those outreach teams are the vital heartbeat of unsheltered work, of working with people who are unsheltered. Our outreach teams are so important and are an integral part of this, of providing people with those services. And people can be dispersed to the communities that have little or no resources. So it's kind of playing whack-a-mole. Like, okay, they're here, then we're going to move them over here. It doesn't end someone's homelessness. And homelessness is now spread out more in the services areas. There's more ground to cover for outreach workers. Now they're having to go over in different areas. And so, like, for example, like in Tempe, if they were pushed out of Tempe, they would go to Phoenix or Mesa or somewhere else where they don't have that engagement or that histrionics with that outreach team. It also, we don't know about communicable diseases and how difficult those are to track and isolate during COVID. As you could imagine, if we were dismantling encampments and pushing people out. I remember during COVID, we were told keep encampments intact, do not push people out, because we didn't know anything about COVID and how it could spread. So businesses and neighbors could get impacted because, we were moving someone without a safe place for them to be. So they pop up at a business or somewhere else. And sweeps don't end homelessness. I want to keep pushing that. Grassroots leaders and direct service providers understand that encampment sweeps cause 4 general problems, and that's they damage the health and well-being and connections to care. They compromise the personal safety of that individual and the civic trust, and they undermine the paths to housing and stability, and they create unnecessary costs to communities. And as we go into, some more areas, it may not have looked like much, but I lost everything I had. So again, the perception is this is junk, but that's somebody's personal property and their everything they may have. They may have pictures of their children they haven't seen in years. They have a picture of their parents who've passed away. They have these are people's personal belongings. And each of these problems present significant challenges to those directly impacted by forced displacement, as well as service providers who care for them, which I know many of you are on this call who really care for the people that you're serving. And as we talked about, it severs those connections to care. Healthcare providers or direct service providers often cannot find their patients after a sweep and have no knowledge of where they might have gone. For some, outreach workers coming to an encampment may have been the only services that they ever received. So think about that. If they were connected to that outreach team and now they're dispersed, that may have been the only connection they had to actually accessing some type of housing or supportive services. And it also destroys life-saving medications and medical equipment. Sweeps can often destroy vital medications that treat chronic and acute illnesses, behavioral health conditions, and physical health conditions like HIV, hepatitis C, diabetes, substance use, schizophrenia, anxiety, depression. It's also especially difficult to manage absent regular medication. So some people, if they get off, they're not going to get back on, or it may take a while to get that replacement medication for them to be able to continue to be treated. And also, they lose their wheelchairs, walkers, canes, and any assistive devices that have been maybe lost or destroyed during those encampments sweeps. And just to touch on this a little bit, just based on my experience here in Arizona around the heat related issues, we get to 110, 15, sometimes almost 120 degrees. And during these severe weather episodes, Phoenix, Arizona, and Keys to Change campus have done a lot of great work around this area of creating heat relief centers around the community that allows people a safe place to be able to get their needs met. It's also, we used it as an engagement technique. So if somebody came in for heat relief, how do we engage them in services? So it's also an engagement technique. And unsheltered and dispersed people prior to disasters, you know, there should be a disaster plan in place. I know, like I said, Phoenix, I know, has a heat relief. But like when we saw Hurricane Helene hit and the other hurricanes hit and the flooding that happened and how it impacted people, there needs to be plans in place to support individuals that are unhoused prior to a severe weather episode hitting. And who warns the people? How is that information getting out? And how are we supporting individuals during these times? Demi, did you want to add anything?
I think the only thing I wanted to add is that Advocates for Human Potential is now working on disaster-related challenges in communities around planning, strategy, resilience, recovery, particularly around homelessness and behavioral health. So please feel free to reach out to us if you need assistance in this area. And now we're going to jump into some recommendations, right? We've talked about, here's all the problems. There are a lot of problems, right? We just in the homeless system in general, and in our governments and trying to solve these issues. So now we have some recommendations for you. First and foremost, we did not want to reinvent the wheel. So prior to any type of engagement, we should have written policies, processes, and procedures in place. So we should not just haphazardly go and shut down encampments, particularly if there's not a health and safety issue, an immediate health and safety need. And those written strategies should define the who, what, where, when, and how you will deal with the encampment response. And again, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, but several agencies have information on how to appropriately respond to encampments, including HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, USICH, our Interagency Council on Homelessness, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, as well as the Veterans Administration. In addition, there's educational institutions that have delved into this area and have written policies and procedures on how to appropriately respond to encampments. This is not about going it alone. These pieces and our plans should be well thought out and in place and then implemented. And all roads should lead to housing and services unless there is an immediate major safety issue that needs to be addressed. An example of an immediate safety issue, we're going to have torrential rain. We've got people living in a flood, zone. High fire season, we've got people in an area that are cooking in a high fire area and we need to get them out of there. Those are reasons why to come in and immediately move people out. Otherwise, we should have well thought out plans that connect people to housing and do not shuffle them around and focus on our system improvements. So the USICH has several principles, and we're not going to go over all of these principles, but the bottom line is there is guidance out there. So you do not have to do this alone. There's, written guidance to give you a good strategy and policies in place to put those things together so that you can use this for communities. I see a lot of hearts popping out because we have federal guidance, right? We have national best practices. This is not something, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? How are we going to solve this? There are several agencies that have a tremendous amount of written material in place to help you to prepare, plan, strategize, and be ready to deal with encampments. And if you need our help, feel free to reach out to us too. Again, we should be focusing on system improvements. Next, my slide is acting out. There it goes. Determine your why you're going to do this. Don't just do it because, a group of people got together and said, we need to do this because the community, the Deme and all of that. That should not be your why. Your why should be, again, to address homelessness and to move people from homelessness into housing. And this should be done, and being prepared is key. You should have your staff trained. You should not be sending staff out there that have not received some sort of training, policies and procedures, how they protect their health and safety, trauma-informed care, harm reduction, motivational interviewing, cultural humility, de-escalation, professional ethics and boundaries. These are baseline trainings that anybody working in government or a homeless service system provider, which is usually funded by government, should have these baseline trainings in place before you send your staff out there to help dismantle an encampment. There should also be connections in place with local partners. These partners should include your city and county. And when I say city and county, work together. We often see politics, right? We're a big city, we're a big county, we're going to do things our way. Well, when you have overlapping jurisdictional boundaries, overlapping funding resources from the feds, state, local resources, our continuum of care, work together in a way that solves the challenges in your community. Involve your healthcare entities, your other organization, such as your LGBTQ organizations, your youth homelessness providers. I'm going to put another plug in there for our young people, and homeless services. Nikki, did you want to jump in here as well? I think you had a couple comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to say also making sure that you have culturally appropriate services available. And I think I might talk about that later on, but I wanted to plug that again, is that different people, it's not a one size fits all, and different people may need different things. So making sure you're connecting before you're going out and just moving people along, making sure you're connecting people to culturally appropriate services that they want and choose. You know, I live in Arizona. We have a lot of indigenous led organizations and a lot of organizations that lead with indigenous healing. Go ahead, Deme.
No, you're talking about it right now. So I was just getting you to the slide. So our culturally responsive services, people should be able to speak to folks in their own language. If you know that this is a Hispanic population in a certain area that we need to go and dismantle, you need to have Spanish speaking workers there that can talk to them in their own language, and be prepared to provide some sort of interpretation services, as well as identifying, you know, other culturally appropriate organizations that you could partner with to dismantle if you're not able to do that on your own. Recognizing that people can have common disabilities, their medical challenges that Nikki mentioned before, their mobility needs. And we also wanted to talk about traumatic brain injury, because that is something that we do see in this field and that is not talked about a lot, but we think we should mention it here. So you've got folks out there with severe needs. And also our pets. How many of you are pet people? I know there's a ton of them on this call because everybody I know has dogs and cats and whatever. I'm not taking in anymore. Like, there go the hearts. I'm not taking in any more animals. I have too many kids, but I'll babysit. I'll babysit the Frenchies for the weekend or whatever. Make a long story short, you have, like all those pet people, you have to also think about people and their pets, because folks aren't leaving those pets out there, right? And so more and more we are seeing people from pet type of organizations get involved because they want to help. And you've got to reach out to these organizations to coordinate with them, so that when you're out there and you have Bob, and Bob has a housing resource, and Bob doesn't want to go because if he can't go without his, you know, his cat or whatever it is, within reason, right? You want to make sure that you're providing some sort of accommodation for that. In certain communities, it is the law. Under fair housing, service dogs are considered, you know, if somebody's going to housing, you have to provide that accommodation, as well as, a lot of people don't know, you have to provide accommodations for a miniature horse, which that's a whole nother story, and you can Google it yourself, but they do fall under the Fair Housing Act. So you need to make sure you are prepared to provide these accommodations for people who may need it. Anything else you wanted to mention, Nikki?
Yeah, one of the things that we used to do is we would have a one-stop shop for unsheltered pets. So people with their pets that are unsheltered. And that was a great way to engage people. So we would get veterinarians who would donate their time. We would get people who would donate booties for dogs' paws, you know, because it's really hot here in Phoenix. And we would get food donated and shots and everything else. And sometimes that was the only thing that would get somebody to come out of the river bottom, out of encampment, is for their animal, was to take care of their animal. They didn't care about their health, but they really cared about ensuring their animal. So it's another great way to engage in leading with services. Again, you don't want to lead with law enforcement or, you know, dismantling. You want to lead with services. So just by reaching with people with pets, you can find another way to engage with people, because sometimes they care more about their pets than they do themselves. And again, I'm going to push culturally responsive services, ensuring that you know where the shelters are for LGBTQ plus people or people who are in transition, where they have a place that they feel safe that they can go to. Also, our youth do not all the time feel safe to go to a shelter, making sure you have youth specific shelter and resources available. Thank you.
Which I'll say is not available in every community, and we know that, but it should be. If you do not have a youth shelter, you need to figure out why. Again, there should be no young people that experience homelessness and living on the street unsheltered. And so we're going to move on to engaging persons with lived experience. We wanted to make sure we didn't forget this point because we think it's very important. Go ahead, Nikki.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, you know, that saying nothing for us without us. So one of the most important things is it's critical to include people who are being impacted by this. Do not think you know better than the people that are being impacted. Make sure you know you are speaking to them to make sure their voice is honored and heard through this process. So one of the things I've done is I held a focus group with those people. Not those people, but, you know, with the people who are unsheltered or in the encampment, and you hold a focus group, you give them a gift card or food or some type of, you know, incentive to either have them engage with you or to just, they should be paid for their experience and for their voice being at the table. And, you know, just going and speaking to people at the encampments, what types of services would they be open to in wanting to engage with to move out of an encampment? So just making sure that we're honoring the folks that are going through this experiencing and not thinking that we know best. That's all I wanted to say.
I'll add to that point, Nikki. You know, there was a time where I actually did a survey of providers and you know, people who were in need. And when we looked at what the providers wanted to offer versus what those folks actually needed, they were totally different. And when we don't ask the people who are closest to the problem, that know how to solve the problem, that can help us solve the problem, but yet we're all back here trying to figure it out. At the end of the day, we need to bring people into the fold that can help us solve the problem. And that means including folks with lived experience of homelessness. Examples of solutions. So we're going to give you guys, we're going to just throw a bunch of examples at you because we feel like you need to know, like, here's what we would do, you know, because Nikki and I are both former continuum of care leads. We both worked in government homeless systems, and we're like, what is our best, you know, kind of ideas that we can give folks to help solve the problem? And so we want to give you these recommendations. Nikki, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, so just some of the things that we've done, and I'll go into some more details in the next slide. You know, having mobile collaboration of services, like a one-stop shop. We've done this with, you know, here in Arizona, we have what's called Project Connect, where all the services, whether that be housing, behavioral health, you know, veteran services, everything, it's under one roof. So it's a one-stop shop that people can go to, and that's a great way to engage with folks. Ongoing community events that provide resources, like, again, same day and same time. Like, we know that they're going to be here every Tuesday at this time, and it's a great way to speak to people. Also having mobile county services, mainstream benefits, Medicaid, medical, EBT, public benefits, Narcan distribution, hygiene kits, vaccines, etc. Veteran specific resources, making sure you're connected to those veteran resources. You know, just like we talk about ensuring that our veterans' needs are met, you need to have those veteran resources available so that people feel comfortable talking to another veteran or somebody in that with that experience. Ensuring you're uploading documents into a system, like here in Arizona, we have what's called HMIS, the Homeless Management Information System, or if you have other data systems that you can upload somebody's, you know, if you know an encampment's, you know, a sweep's coming, let me upload your documents into HMIS so that if you lose them, we have them somewhere. So if your name comes to the top of the waiting list, we have those documents already. We're not going and searching for those. Opening up a navigation center as a meeting point for certain clients, certain day and time frame. Your local library, like, again, in Tempe, we were embedded in the local library because it's a safe place for people to go and ask for services. And there was never any stigma attached to going into a library. People feel safe going to the library. You can bring your kids into the library. So it is a safe place for folks to go and access those services.
One collaboration of services. So if you have mobile services, try to be in the same place at the same time on certain days and get the word out to people experiencing homelessness so that they show up. So that if encampment sweeps are happening, they know you're going to be in a certain location on Thursday at 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock. So the more you can coordinate and ensure that people experiencing homelessness know that your mobile services will be available at a certain time and certain place will be very helpful, particularly in communities that are dismantling encampments.
Yeah, so examples, creating that safe outdoor space. Again, I'm going to shout out my peeps in Phoenix, Arizona is doing a great job of creating a safe outdoor space for people, providing services on site, food on site, restrooms. So it's a clean environment where they can engage in services and they feel safe. Identifying land that people can safely sleep in, they also have those, safe parking spaces and providing those wraparound services. And also, there's a lot of comments about housing first. We often say it's housing first, not housing only. And we're providing people with supportive services and we're meeting people where they're at, literally and figuratively. Hotel, shelter, interim housing, specific set aside units for families, youth, DV survivors, high acuity people, 24-hour phone lines for services available for people in need of shelter and services, email, and other communication strategies to report encampments. So in Tempe, we created a way that people could report an encampment to the city, and then we would deploy our outreach teams to that encampment to engage people with services. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about was, getting everybody on board, and that includes our faith-based community as well. They often have services of it, often have resources and money and food and things like that. So encouraging you to connect to your local faith-based community as well. And one of the other things that we did in the city of Tempe is that we created an interdepartmental collaboration. So if you work for a government agency, you guys can create your own teams internally, because what happens is the silos of departments, and they're all dealing with the same issue of ending homelessness, or dealing with homelessness, I should say, in some departments. And how do you bring in like homeless solutions or human services? And we should be leading those efforts, the human services and homeless solutions departments. And so we had monthly meetings, and also, at the beginning we had meetings every 2 weeks. And so we would include the outreach teams, trained police officers. And one of the things that I liked is that Tempe allowed for us as the homeless solutions department to train these officers. So we actually trained them in harm reduction, train them in other areas, so that when they're dealing with people experiencing homelessness, they know to lead with services and not lead with criminalization. And also working with your Parks and Rec department, the housing department, because housing ends homelessness. So how do you work with your department to identify units that can be set aside specifically for people who are living in encampments? How do you work with your public works department who collect the debris? So we had a plan in place, that they would come and collect the debris after we had, led with services and supported folks. So they would come in at the tail end. And also your behavioral health and crisis teams. There's no one size fits all solution. And if you work to end homelessness and you're part of a local, state, or federal government, these are some of the recommendations that we used in our community to end homelessness. And some of those one of my other recommendations is to focus on one encampment at a time. Allow trained outreach teams to lead these efforts. Meet people where they are, literally. Like, you bring the services to them. Don't expect that people are going to have to go across town into an office to get those services. You're leading with those services and you're meeting people where they're at. And what we also did was we left notices at the encampment if nobody was there. And during our outreach to inform people to that a cleanup was coming, the date of the cleanup, and the approximate time of the cleanup, and provide information, written information on resources to get assistance. You can leave that there if no one's there, if no one's home, you know, their home, you could leave it there. We also created a phone number and an email address that went directly to our team that people could ask for assistance. And that was monitored by us 24 hours a day. One of the other unique things we did was we created a post office box for for the city of Tempe unhoused residents. And so folks were able to get their IDs, birth certificates. We got birth certificates from all over the United States, and also in other countries, we were able to get people's birth certificates. So it was a unique way that we can actually contribute to ending someone's homelessness. We also rented hotel blocks. So knowing that an encampment sweep was coming, that one had to be dismantled, we had hotel blocks that were paid by the Human Services Department that we would put people who had high needs, high medical needs, so they had a safe place to engage in services. Also, we connected with, if you guys aren't familiar with Circle the City, which is a medical respite, we had a nurse that would actually go out with us once a week to do outreach to people who had medical issues and identifying those individuals with high needs. And also, I want to remind people that, you know, and I've done lots of focus groups with unsheltered folks, and one of the things they would say is that they're giving me information, I do not understand it. We have this idea that we're going to shove a bunch of words in front of somebody and they're going to understand what we're trying to explain. Some people are illiterate, some people do not have high reading levels, and making sure that you're being mindful of who you're communicating with, what you're trying to communicating with, who you're trying to communicate with. And a bunch of words on paper mean nothing to some people. Make sure it is at a level that everyone can understand.
And we wanted to give you guys a couple of examples that we found throughout the country that we thought were really cool examples. And we know that there's many examples, right? There's a lot of communities doing a lot of great work. And I don't want to downplay that, because I've been a part of many of those communities that are doing great work and have came up with really innovative solutions. But here in the city of Philadelphia, they have actually a intervention and treatment focused sidewalk behavior ordinance. It's a formal partnership between their Office of Homeless Solutions and the police department. And it mandates that if a person is on the street in need of services, that they're connected to housing, even if law enforcement is the first responder. So the statute clearly defines each partner's roles and their responsibilities, including transportation protocols and training requirements. So we thought we would share that one with you because we really liked how the police department is working with the Office of Homeless Services. And next, there's a technical assistance provider that is called Clutch Consulting. And they actually have a direct housing encampment response project that they're doing in different communities. And it is literally moving people off the streets into housing rapidly within 10 days. It's a public-private partnership. They leverage public funds for rehousing folks quickly, and they pair that with some private funds from local philanthropy that is allowing them to focus intensively on one encampment from a single location, bringing housing and services to the site. They have a landlord engagement team that has a flexible fund that can pay for units quickly so people can move in very rapidly. And they have a team of folks really rehousing people immediately. And so we love that, because how difficult is it to get somebody housed? Usually we got to get them off the street. We put them in a hotel. From the hotel, we got to find a landlord who will rent to them. They're doing all this in 10 days. They have this set up to do in 10 days. So I'm putting a plug in for them, and I hope that you guys will reach out to them and learn about their model, because it's been successful in Oklahoma City, New Orleans. They're working in Dallas and Houston and a few other places, and they're rapidly getting people housed in a new, innovative way that solves people's homelessness quickly. And we are just about to close and leave a little bit of time for some feedback, but we wanted to add this here because we believe that when an encampment is prioritized for closure, The processes must be implemented in a humane and trauma-informed way, and the goal must be to connect every person to housing and services to help them overcome future experiences of homelessness. This came from the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, this quote, and so we wanted to leave you that. And lastly, Nikki, I'll let you close this out.
Well, again, we want to say with wellness, I don't know, I'm getting feedback. Can you mute yourself, Deme?
I can hear you.
I'm getting feedback.
I don't know where it's coming.
All right, thank you. So wellness begins at home. So we really believe that without a safe place to call home, nothing else matters. And how you end homelessness is through having a safe place to be, just like all of us. If we don't have a safe place to feel supported and loved, nothing else matters. I don't know if you want to add anything else, Deme.
No, I think that's it. We're gonna close out, and we're gonna leave some space. If you guys have any questions or comments in the chat, we'll look at some of those that we've already collected and just have some feedback time. Somebody asked what was a continuum of care. We did drop a link to the continuum of care in the chat. I also saw another person mention that there's no youth resources. I'd like to drop another resource in the chat, which is the HUD Youth Demonstration Program. It is where a continuum of care can actually apply for funds to solve youth homelessness in their community. And they actually also have a strategic planning grant as well. So I'm dropping that in the chat. Thank you so much. I see very helpful presentation. Thank you so much. Our contact information is here on this last slide as well. Please feel free to reach out to us anytime. We do national technical assistance and training around the country, and we get a chance to help solve homelessness all around the country, and we get to do it for a living. So if you need our help, feel free to reach out.
Thank you all for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. We appreciate it. Such an important topic.
Do we have organizations that specifically work with transgender and non-binary populations? There are some national organizations, and we would need to know a little bit more about the community that you specifically live in to be able to refer you to some resources. So if you want to reach out to us and continue the conversation, please send us an email and we will look into that for you.
And I could say specifically off the top of my head, True Colors
is one for young people. Yeah. Annabelle, thank you so much. Often in many communities, there's an LGBTQ center that will be there working on LGBT issues. Thank you so much, Anish. I hope I said that right.
Anisha, I think.
Oh, I'm missing part of the name. Here we go. Awesome. Okay, so we are going to close out now without seeing a lot going on in the chat. A lot of thank yous, and we appreciate you all. Thank you for chiming in and listening to us. We're going to try to bring you, compelling topics at least once a quarter. Oh, it looks like we've got something. Somebody said we want to hear thoughts around equity and prioritization of resources. People expect them to do, but equity and prioritization of resources. That is a very tough conversation because we are not supposed to prioritize people by race. And
no, I think she's talking about equity as far as unsheltered encampments versus somebody in the shelter themselves right now.
Okay, got it. I think that's a whole nother challenge too, right? It requires a systemic response that strategizes on how we'll deal with somebody who's unsheltered living on the street versus somebody unsheltered living versus somebody sheltered living in a shelter. And this is part of why it's really important to have your continuum of care at the table and having these discussions. Nikki, I see you want to chime in.
No, and I just want to say some of that too is about the cost effectiveness, the cost associated with somebody being in an encampment is more expensive to the community versus somebody who's in a shelter. So it is, and they also may have higher needs. It's kind of like going to emergency room, and I have a gunshot wound versus a broken ankle. The gunshot wound's going to get the services first. So it's more of thinking about it in that way of an emergency room. There's only a certain amount of doctors available, and who can serve who's in the most at need right now. So it's looking at those folks who are the most at need and prioritizing that population, because it's a more cost-effective solution and they have a lot more barriers.
We hope we answered that question. Do we have metrics, information on the outcome of programs that create sanctioned encampments where participants? I have seen some materials around sanctioned encampments and what that looks like, but I don't have specific metrics or information on that. But if you want to reach out to us afterwards, we'd love to continue the conversation. Because there is such a thing as a sanctioned encampment where the government will actually allow it and bring in resources to support it, such as bathrooms, hand washing stations, etc.
Yeah, Phoenix has one, a safe shelter space, and the services are brought to the food served 3 times a day, and they were able to house a bunch of people through those efforts, and it's still operational.
I do know that there are some communities too doing what's called safe camping. There's actually a pilot of that happening in San Diego, where they have folks in tents that they have funded to shelter them intermittently while they work to get them housed. So in essence, that is, considered, I would say, similar to a sanctioned encampment, although that's probably not what it's called. But at the end of the day, there's a few examples of, safe camping, safe parking, things of that nature, as well as sanctioned encampments. Awesome. So glad you all could join us. We are honored to present this for you all and hope that we can continue the conversation.
Yes, please be in touch. Anybody who's on the line, anybody who's on the line that does this work every day, thank you, thank you, thank you. We appreciate
Yes, thank you so much for all your hard work in the homeless system. We know it's hard, and you keep showing up. You keep showing up every day. And so we just, blessings, and we're here if you need anything in the background to support. But thank you so much for attending, and we hope you can use some of this information for your own communities.
All right. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.